You are watching the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. The Humanities 101 Foundation welcomes you.
Hey there, Nacho Knots, and welcome back to NACHOS, the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. I'm really glad that you're here because we're sitting in a threshold moment right now, that quiet space between the end of March and the beginning of April. And there's something about this time of year that can feel, well, for lack of a better word, complicated. Because on one hand, the world is starting to wake up. There are little hints of spring everywhere, longer days, softer light, the sense that something is shifting just beneath the surface. But on the other hand, life doesn't always move at the same pace as the seasons. Some of us might feel energized, others might feel exhausted. And some of us might be somewhere in between or cycling through both in the same day. And all of it belongs right here. So wherever you're coming in from today, whether you're feeling hopeful, overwhelmed, steady, scattered, or something you don't quite have words for yet, I just want to start by saying you're allowed to arrive exactly as you are. No catching up, no performing, no pretending that things are more together than they actually feel. Just being here is enough. And today, as we move from one month into another, we're going to spend time together thinking about what it means to live inside those in-between spaces. Those moments where things aren't quite what they were, but not fully what they're going to be yet. And there's something else that can happen in moments like this. When the seasons begin to shift, when the light changes, when routines start to loosen or stretch, it can bring a kind of awareness with it. Sometimes a gentle awareness, sometimes a louder awareness. Because change, it's around us everywhere in the world. And it has a way of stirring change inside of us as well. And that doesn't always feel like excitement. Sometimes it feels like questions, anxiety, worry. Where am I supposed to be right now? Am I doing enough? Should things feel different than they do? Why do I not feel like a new me? Why does this moment feel heavier or more uncertain than I'd expected? And all of those questions, they arrive quickly. They can show up sometimes all at once, like a kind of internal noise that's hard to turn down. And for a lot of us, especially those of us who are navigating a world not built for us and that feels unpredictable, these seasonal transitions don't just live outside of us. They land in the nervous system. They can disrupt rhythms. They can pull at our sense of predictability. They can make things that felt manageable a few weeks ago suddenly feel harder to hold. And then the worry starts to layer in. Worry about whether we're keeping up. Worry about whether we're falling behind. Worry about things we can name, and sometimes worry about things that we can't quite explain, but still feel very real in our bodies. And if that's happening right now inside of you, I want to gently name something. That response makes sense. Not because something is wrong with you, but because you're responding to change. And change, even the kind we want, even the kind we hope for, even the kind that signals growth, often asks something from us. It asks for energy, adjustment, recalibration. And it can feel like tension before it ever feels like clarity. So if you notice yourself questioning more than usual or worrying more than you'd like, you're not alone in this, and you're not behind. You might just be in the middle of a transition your mind and body are still learning how to understand. And in moments like that, when the questions get a little louder, when the worry starts to hum in the background, there can be a pull to do one of two things. To either try to figure out everything all at once, to solve the whole future in a single setting, or to shut it all down, to disconnect, to push the feeling away because it's too much to sort out, too much to deal with. But there's another way, a quieter way, a steadier way. And it starts with listening, not to the noise or the pressure, not to the timelines or the expectations. It comes from listening to something closer. Your body, your heart, your internal sense of knowing, even if it feels faint or in the distance right now. Because often, before we have the answer, we get a signal, a sense of tension, a sense of fatigue, a sense of curiosity, a sense of worry, of resistance, or even a small flicker of relief when we imagine one path over another. And those signals matter. They're not always loud and they're not always clear, but they are information. They are data. And when we slow down enough to notice them, we know and we come to understand that we don't have to solve everything. We just have to choose the next right step. Not the perfect step, not the 5-year plan, not the version of the decision that makes everything make sense forever. Just the next right step. The one that feels a little more aligned, a little more honest, a little more sustainable for where you are right now. And maybe that step is resting. Maybe it's sending one email or asking for help. Maybe it's saying no to something that has been stretching you too thin. Or it's simply pausing long enough to let your system catch up with everything that it's been carrying. And here's the part that I think we don't say enough. Choosing the next right step is enough. It doesn't mean you figured everything out, and it doesn't mean that uncertainty disappears, but it does mean that you're staying in relationship with yourself. You're not abandoning your needs in the rush to resolve the discomfort. You're moving with yourself instead of against yourself. And over time, those small steps, those small right enough small steps have a way of becoming a path. Not a perfect one, not a straight one, but a real one. One that you can actually walk. And maybe this is where we can bring in a different way of understanding. Understanding of what's happening to us, what's happening around us, what's happening inside of us. A way that doesn't treat our uncertainty as something to eliminate, but as something we can learn to move with. There's a quote that's been kicking around in my brain all week, and it's a quote by Jonas Salk. And if you don't know who Jonas Salk is, he's the medical researcher and scientist best known for developing the polio vaccine. He was someone who spent his life trying to solve problems that once felt overwhelming and uncertain. And he said this, quote, "Intuition will tell the thinking mind where to look next," end quote. Intuition will tell the thinking mind where to look next. And I love this. I love it because it reframes the relationship between feeling and thinking. Here's someone whose work depended on rigorous thought, careful analysis, and deep scientific inquiry, and even he is reminding us that thinking isn't always the starting point. It doesn't mean we abandon logic. It doesn't mean we stop analyzing or reflecting on making thoughtful decisions, but it suggests that thinking doesn't always have to lead to something. Sometimes it follows to something. Sometimes the first signal doesn't come as a fully formed plan or clear answer or even a hypothesis. It comes as a feeling, a pulse, a pull, a pause, a quiet sense of this way, not that way, an invisible hand. And then the thinking mind steps in, not to override it, not to dismiss it, but to explore it. To ask, okay, if this is the direction that feels right, where do I look next? And when we're in those in-between spaces like we are now at the end of March, the beginning of April moments of transition, that can be a powerful, powerful reorientation. Because instead of demanding certainty from ourselves, we can begin with attention. What is my body noticing? What feels heavy? What feels lighter? Where do I feel a little more grounded, even if nothing is fully resolved? And then we let our thinking mind do what it does best. Not solve everything, but follow a thread. Scratch an itch. One step, one question, one small act of alignment at a time. And that, to me, Nacho Knots, it's a very different kind of movement. It's not forced. It's not frantic. It's guided. And what's really interesting is that this idea that intuition can guide where we go next is it's not just philosophical. It's showing up in research right now. There's a piece that was released on March 26, 2026 through Science Daily. And it was a study conducted by researchers at the University of Geneva. The article is entitled "Unconscious Brain Activity Shapes Decision-Making Before We Are Aware of It." And what the researchers were exploring is something many of us have felt, but maybe haven't always had the language for. They were looking at how the brain begins making decisions, or at least begins leaning towards a decision before we're consciously aware of it. And what they did was fascinating. They used brain imaging, and they were able to observe the certain patterns of neural activity. They watched it start organizing seconds before a person can actually report what they've decided. And in other words, the brain is already moving, already sorting, already weighing, and orienting itself towards a direction before the thinking mind steps in and says, okay, here's what I have decided. And when we bring that into a more everyday understanding, it starts to shift how we think about those quiet internal signals, those pulls and pauses and pulses, those feelings of something's off. I feel it in my gut. The sense of this might be the right move, or this might not be the right move. That pause you feel in your body before you can explain why. Those aren't interruptions to thinking. They're part of the process. The study suggests that what we call intuition may actually be the early expression of the brain's decision-making systems at work, processing patterns, experiences, and context faster than conscious awareness can catch up. And then our thinking mind arrives to interpret, to justify, to rationalize, to put language around something that in many ways has already begun. And I want to slow down here for a moment, because this is where the connection becomes really, really meaningful. For people in general, this helps explain why we don't always think our way into clarity. Sometimes we think too much. Sometimes clarity begins as a feeling and becomes a thought later. But for neurodivergent folks, this can land even more deeply, because many of us are already navigating the world through heightened pattern recognition, through sensory awareness, through attunement to shifts in environment, tone, or expectation that honestly others might not immediately notice or ever notice at all. And those signals can show up early. They can show up fast. And they can show up without a neat linear explanation attached to them or even our awareness of them. And in a world that often says, if you can't explain it, it doesn't count, those signals can get questioned, dismissed, or even turned inward as self-doubt. But what this research is gently reminding us is that those early signals are not a failure of reasoning. They're a part of reasoning, just happening in a different register, a different key, on a different timeline. And when we pair that with Salk's idea of intuition that will tell the thinking mind where to go next, we begin to see a kind of partnership. Intuition doesn't replace thinking. Intuition guides it. It says to thinking, start here, look here, pay attention to this. And then the thinking mind can do what it does best. Not override, but follow. And maybe, Nacho Knots, as we sit in this space between seasons, between questions and answers, between uncertainty and whatever comes next, that's enough. Not to have it all figured out, but to trust that if something inside you is nudging you, even quietly, it might just be pointing you towards where to look next, the next right step. And if we stay with that idea for a moment, that the body is already moving, already sensing, already guiding us, then there's another piece of research that brings this even closer to home. Not just in the brain, but in the gut. There was a study released March 28th of this year, also featured in Science Daily, and this is research out of the University of California in San Francisco. And the article is titled, "Scientists Discover Why Your Appetite Suddenly Disappears When You're Sick." And I know that this is one of those things that I've always wondered ever since I was a kid. And on the surface, it sounds like something we already know, right? You get sick, you don't feel like eating. But what the researchers uncovered is something much deeper. They found that the gut isn't just passively reacting to illness. It's actively communicating with the brain. Specifically, the study showed that when the body detects something like a parasite or an infection, specialized cells in the gut send signals through the immune and nervous systems, essentially kind of telling the brain, now is not the right time to eat. And what's fascinating is that this doesn't always happen immediately. The signals build. At first, you might feel relatively normal, and then almost suddenly, your appetite drops off. And that's not random. It's coordinated. It's a coordinated response between the gut, the immune system, and the brain, all working together to shift your behavior in a way that supports healing, in a way that you may not be aware. And when we step back and look at that in a broader, more human way, it starts to change how we think about the gut and our own behavior. Because it's not just about digestion, it's about communication. The gut is sensing what's happening to your body, interpreting it, and then influencing behavior. It's not just reacting, it's guiding. And that connects so directly to what we were just talking about. That feeling, that intuition, that sense in your body that something is off or that something needs to shift. It's not always something you think your way into. Sometimes your body just tells you first. And in this case, the gut is literally shaping behavior, changing appetite, changing energy, changing what feels possible even, before the thinking mind has any narrative of it. And again, I want to pause here, especially for neurodivergent folks, because many neurodivergent folks experience the body's signals intensely, especially tummy issues. Sometimes as gut feelings, sometimes as sensory overwhelm, sometimes as a sudden loss of capacity that doesn't seem to make sense to even us. And especially doesn't make sense to anyone around us. In a world that often asks us to explain ourselves before we're allowed to respond, those signals can feel confusing or even invalidating, or even, if you cannot communicate in that moment, impossible. But what this research is showing us is that the body is not arbitrary. It's not overreacting for no reason. It's constantly scanning, interpreting, and adjusting. And sometimes, just sometimes, it changes our behavior before we understand fully why. So when we place this alongside Salk's idea about intuition telling the thinking mind where to look next, and we add this layer, that the body itself is part of the intuitive system, we begin to see something a little more integrated. The gut speaks, the body signals, the intuition nudges, and then the thinking mind catches up. And maybe, Nacho Nuts, as we move through these seasons of transitions, it's not just about asking, what do I do next? It's also asking about, what is my body already trying to tell me? And then ask yourself if you can listen. And then even, can you listen before you fully understand? And maybe this is where something begins to open up for us on an individual level, because the more we understand about our body, our hearts, our souls, our minds, and about how it senses, processes, and communicates, the more we begin to realize that our experience of reality is not just something that happens to us. It's something we're constantly interpreting. And interpretation, even our own personal interpretations, can change. When we don't have the language for what we're feeling, those experiences can come across as confusing or even wrong, shameful, bad. A tightness in the chest becomes anxiety we think we should fix. A loss of appetite becomes something we push through. You got to feed it. A sudden shift in energy becomes something we judge as lazy. But when we begin to understand that the body is signaling that it's participating in meaning making, those same experiences start to feel different. They're not problems to eliminate. They're messages to consider. And language plays such a powerful role in that shift. There's something almost transformative about learning a word that names an experience, especially one that names an experience you've had before but couldn't quite understand or hold in your hand. I often think of a word like schadenfreude. That complicated feeling of finding a flicker of satisfaction in someone else's misfortune. Before you have the word, you might experience that feeling with a sense of guilt or confusion or shame. Why would I feel this? What does that say about me? Am I a horrible person? But when you know that that feeling has a name, it becomes something human, something recognized, something that exists across cultures and histories, whether they have a name for it or not. Not something that you invented in your evil mind, not something that makes you broken, just something that is. And that naming doesn't mean we act on every feeling. It doesn't mean we stop reflecting or growing, but it does mean we can hold our experiences with a little less shame and a little more curiosity. And when we bring that back to the body, to intuition, to gut signals, to those early pre-verbal nudges, we start to see that understanding creates space. Space to notice without immediately judging. Space to feel without immediately correcting. Space to ask gently, what might this be telling me? And in that space, our reality shifts. Not because the world outside of us has changed, but because our relationship to what we're experiencing has softened. And that softening, that willingness to understand rather than suppress, can be the beginning of something really, really powerful. Not control, not certainty, but connection to ourselves and to our bodies and to the quiet intelligence that's been there all along. And as we sit with that idea, that understanding creates space, that naming something can soften it, there's another layer to this conversation that feels really, really important to bring in. Because sometimes what we're experiencing in ourselves, especially around attention, focus, or consistency, it gets interpreted through a narrow lens, a behavioral lens, a productivity lens, a try harder lens. But what if underneath those experiences, something else is happening entirely? Not a lack of effort, but a different pattern of functioning. Published on St. Patrick's Day here on 2026 on Science Daily. It was published or presented to the Society for Neuroscience and published in Science Daily. And the article is entitled ADHD Brains Show Sleep-Like Activity Even While Awake. And I want to take a moment with that because even the title itself quietly challenges a lot of assumptions. What the researchers found is that individuals with ADHD, parts of their brain can briefly enter what are called sleep-like states, even while the person is fully awake, engaged, and willingly trying to focus. Not asleep in the way that we typically think of it, but certain regions essentially dim, pause, take what looks like a micro rest. And researchers sometimes refer to this as local sleep, where one part of the brain needs a break, even while the rest of the system is still online. And when those moments happen, they don't look like rest on the outside. They look like distraction, like zoning out, like missed steps, delayed responses, or inconsistent attention. In other words, they look like the very things people with ADHD are so often judged for. But this is where the understanding begins to shift, at least when we take in neuroscience, because what this research suggests is that those moments are not simply choices. They're not about discipline. They're not about motivation. They are physiological. They are neurological. They are the brain attempting to regulate itself in the middle of demand. And that changes the story in a really, really profound way. Because instead of asking ourselves, why couldn't I stay focused? We might begin to ask ourselves, what is my brain needing right now? Instead of pushing harder into frustration, we can start to notice patterns. When does this happen? What kind of tasks bring this feeling on? What happens right before this shift in attention? And all of a sudden, what once felt like failure will start to feel like information. This is what I do. People ask me all the time, how did I start my journey in understanding myself? It was listening. It was taking failure, not as failure, but as information and as lesson. And this is where it connects so deeply to everything we've been talking about. The intuition that nudges before we can explain, the gut that signals before we understand, the language that gives shape to experience, and now the brain itself quietly communicating through these moments. Not in words, not in neat explanations, but in patterns, in pauses, in shifts in capacity. And for neurodivergent folks, this can be incredibly important to hold on to because so many of these experiences have been framed for us and by us and to us as personal shortcomings, as inconsistency, as lack of follow through, as something to fix. But what if those moments are not interruptions of who you are, but expressions of how your brain is working to care for itself and care for you? Not always in ways that fit the environment or the situation, but in ways that are easy, and not always in ways that are easy to explain, but definitely in ways that are real, ways that are true. And for me, this is where the invitation becomes gentler. Not to lower expectations, not to stop thriving or setting goals, but to shift the relationship, to move from judgment to curiosity, from pressure to understanding. Because when we understand what's happening beneath the surface, we don't just gain knowledge, we gain compassion. And that can change everything about how we move forward. And maybe this is where we begin to turn just a little from understanding towards moving forward. Because all of this, the intuition, the body, the brain, the language, it doesn't just stay internal. It shapes how we show up in the world, how we make space for one another in the world. And as we move from March into April, we're also stepping into something that holds a lot of meaning for many in this community, because April is Autism Awareness Month. And so I want to pause on that word just for a moment, awareness. Because for a long time, awareness was about visibility, about making sure people knew that autism and autistic people existed. But for many of us now, the conversation has been shifting from awareness to understanding, to acceptance, to affirmation, to asking not just, do you see us, but do you understand us? Are you building spaces where we can actually be as we are? And in April, in that way, it becomes less about a single message and more about a series of conversations. Moments where people come together to listen, to learn, to reflect, to challenge, to build. And I'll be a part of a few of these spaces coming this month, not as something separate from what we've been talking about today, but as an extension of it. On April 10th, I'll be doing a virtual event through the Genesee District Library. So if you're someone who prefers to join from your own space, that's an option. It's virtual. On April 14th, I'll be at the Beautiful Minds Conference at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And this has both an in-person and a virtual option. There, I'm going to be talking about micro accommodations and what it looks like to create neuro-affirming workspaces, especially as more and more neurodivergent individuals are entering and reshaping both our higher learning institutions and our workforce. The next day, on April 15th, I'll be in Lansing, working with the Self Advocates of Michigan for the Voices in Action event. And we're going to be spending time thinking about advocacy, connection, and how to build relationships that actually move things forward at the level of policy and community. And there are going to be more moments like this throughout the month, some planned, some still taking shape or being planned. And so if you're someone who's feeling that pull to engage, even in a small way, you are welcome to reach out through humanities101.org or at info@humanities101.org. Not as an obligation, not as something you should do, but as an invitation, as something you can do. Because really, at the end of the day, it's not about events. It's about connection. It's about continuing the kind of understanding we've been talking about here and letting it ripple outwards in conversations, in workplaces, in classrooms, in the quiet ways we learn to be a little more human with each other. And that kind of movement doesn't have to be loud to matter. Sometimes it starts exactly like this, with awareness, with understanding, with one small step forward. And this is where something really practical begins to emerge, because when we talk about micro accommodations, we're not talking about sweeping institutional changes that take years and thousands of dollars to implement. We're talking about small, intentional shifts, the kind that happen in real time, in classrooms, in workplaces, in conversations. Letting someone keep their camera off, offering instructions in more than one format, building in a little extra processing time, making space for someone to step away and regulate without penalty. On their own, each of these might seem small, but together, they become something much bigger. They become universal design in action, not as a theory, not as a policy document sitting somewhere on a shelf in an HR office, but as lived practice, as a way of saying, I'm not going to design this space for one kind of person and then ask everyone else to adjust. I'm going to start from the assumption that people are different, that needs are varied, and that capacity, even within the individual, shifts. And then I'm going to build with that in mind. And there's something quietly powerful about that. Because in a world that often tells us to fit in, to push through, to adapt ourselves to systems that were never designed for us, micro accommodations become a kind of gentle resistance. Not loud, not confrontational, but steady. A refusal to accept that exclusion is just the way things are. A decision again and again and again to make space, even when it's not required, even when no one asked. And when we do that, we're not just helping one person. We're reshaping the world itself. Because when you design for the margins, you expand what's possible for everyone. The person who needed that flexibility benefits, but so does the person who was tired that day. The person who was overwhelmed. The person who just needed it in a different way. And all of a sudden, what started as an accommodation becomes a norm. And I think there's something really hopeful in that. Because it reminds us that change doesn't only happen through massive, sweeping reform. It also happens in these small, consistent choices. These moments where we decide to listen to the body, to trust the signal, to make space for difference, to build with care. And for those of you who are working on projects around micro accommodations right now, this is where your work matters. Not because it has to be perfect, not because it has to solve everything, but because it participates in something real, something that moves us slowly but meaningfully towards a world filled with environments that actually have everyone in mind. And that kind of world isn't built all at once. It's built in moments like this one. It's built with people like us, with communities like ours. Not in isolation, not through one voice trying to carry everything, but through a quiet, shared understanding. A kind of collective moment where we begin to say, maybe not all at once even, maybe not loudly at first, but steadily, we start to say, we're not going to keep doing this the same way anymore. We're not going to keep forcing ourselves or others into systems that don't recognize the full range of what it means to be human. We're not going to keep mistaking struggle for failure when it might actually be a signal. We're not going to keep overlooking the small changes that could make a real difference. And there's something powerful about that kind of togetherness, because it doesn't require perfection. It just requires participation, a willingness to notice, a willingness to adjust, a willingness to build something, even in small ways, that reflect the world we actually want to live in. And when enough of those moments begin to connect, that's how change happens. Not at once, but undeniably. And speaking of building, there's something I want to share with you, because this is the idea of rethinking systems, of creating space, of understanding ourselves and each other more fully. It's not just something I've been talking about here. It's something I've been working on for quite a while now. And I'm really close to being able to bring it into the world in a new way. I'm in the final stages of moving forward with my book project focused on masculinity and autism. It's tentatively titled Unmasking Manhood. Right now, I'm in the final stages with the publishers, and they're doing what publishers do. They're crossing the T's, dotting the I's, and working through the details and the numbers, finishing up the final ink on the contract. So I don't have everything yet that I can share, but what I can say is this: it's moving forward. And if all continues the way it's been going, there's a really good chance that Unmasking Manhood, or whatever we decide the title is, will be in your hands within the year. And I want to share that not as an announcement, but as part of this same thread. Because this book is coming out of the very things we have been talking about today. Listening to the body, listening to you, understanding the mind, asking questions, questioning the systems we've inherited, and asking what it would look like to build something better, something more human, something that makes space. And the truth is that work doesn't belong to just one project or one person. It belongs to all of us. And it's already happening right here with us. And we begin to come, and so as we come closer to this, I can just tell you, I can't wait to share more information with you. And so stay tuned, follow for more, all of that other fun stuff. So as we begin to come to a close today, it might be helpful to just take a step back together, not to summarize everything perfectly, but to notice what has been folding across this conversation. We started, with March, April, the in-between spaces that shift, and how these moments of transition can bring questions with them. A kind of internal stirring. Moments where we wonder if we're on the right path, or if we're doing enough, or why things feel the way they do. And instead of rushing to resolve any of that, we slowed down. We made space for the idea that maybe we don't need the answers all at once. That we can listen to the body, to the heart, and to that quiet internal signal and choose the next right step. From there, we brought in Salk's reminder that intuition doesn't compete with thinking, it guides it. It gives the thinking mind somewhere to begin. And then we layered in what research is showing us, that the brain is often already moving, processing, orienting, leaning towards decisions before we're consciously aware of any of it. That the gut isn't just along for the ride. It's actively communicating, shaping behavior, helping us to respond to what's happening inside of us. And that the ADHD brain, in moments that might look like distraction or inconsistency from the outside, may actually be regulating itself, pausing in small ways, trying to meet the demands placed on it, not failing, but functioning just differently. And as all of that came together, we spent some time with the power of understanding itself. How naming an experience, having language for something we felt but couldn't quite explain, can soften it, can move it out of shame and into something human, into something understood, into something shared. And from there, we widened the lens. We moved from understanding ourselves to thinking about how we build spaces for each other through micro accommodations, through these small intentional shifts that reflect the deeper truth, that deeper truth that people are different. And that needs change. That capacity isn't fixed. And that when we design with all of this in mind, we don't just support a few people. We expand what's possible for everyone. So maybe what all of this points towards is something both simple and profound. That the body, the brain, the nervous system are not problems to solve. They are systems that are constantly communicating. And when we begin to understand those signals rather than ignore them, even if we understand them just a little more than we did yesterday or before, something shifts. We start to meet ourselves differently, with a little less judgment, with a little more curiosity, and from a place where we're able to take a step forward that actually belongs to us. And as we come out of all of this, this might be a good place to pause and let some of these ideas settle, not as concepts to hold on to perfectly, but as reminders we can carry with us through the next day, week, month. So I want to offer a few affirmations. And as you hear them, don't force anything. Just notice if one of them lands. Take what you need and leave the rest, as I always say. So the first affirmation: I can trust that my body is communicating with me. And this connects to everything we explored about the gut, the brain, and intuition. That feeling you get, that pause, that shift in energy or focus, it's not random. It's information. You don't have to understand it immediately, but you can begin by trusting that there is a reason for it. So what's the next affirmation? I don't have to solve everything at once. And that brings us back to that in-between space, that transition between seasons, between questions and answers. You're allowed to take one step at a time. Clarity doesn't always come all at once. Sometimes it unfolds as you move. The next affirmation: my way of thinking and processing is valid. This connects directly to what we talked about with the ADHD brain. Those moments of pause, of drifting, of needing to reset, they're not failures of character. They're part of how your brain regulates and responds. Different doesn't mean less. So let's move on to the next one. Understanding myself allows me to meet myself with compassion. This is where language and awareness comes in. When you can name what you're experiencing, it shifts the way you hold on to it. It goes from confusion to recognition, from judgment to curiosity. And that shift can be powerful. It can be very, very powerful in realms of self-forgiveness and self-grace. The next affirmation: small changes can create meaningful impact. This ties into the idea of micro-accommodations and universal design. You don't have to change everything overnight, but small, thoughtful adjustments for yourself or for others can reshape a space in real and meaningful ways. And all of those changes matter. And finally, one more affirmation to hold on to today. I'm part of building a world that makes space for people like me. This is the larger arc of everything we've talked about, everything we work on, and everything we're about here. We're not just navigating systems, we're shaping them through the way that we show up, through the choices that we make, and through the care that we bring into our spaces. Even in the smallest moments, all of it counts. So as we sit with these, take what feels useful, leave what doesn't, and trust that wherever you are right now, right here, you're allowed to begin from that point. And before we close today, I want to leave you with one question to sit with. And if you're comfortable, again, feel free to share your thoughts in the chat or wherever you comment here. You don't have to answer perfectly. It's just something to notice. So here's the question. What is one small signal your body or mind has been giving you lately? And what might it look like to take one gentle step in response to it? Now, this could be something physical, something emotional, or something you've been putting off, something you've been quietly needing. There's no right answer here, just a moment of noticing and naming, and maybe a moment of care in how you respond. So as we wrap up our time together today, I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here, for showing up as you are, and for taking a little time to reflect, to listen, and to consider what it might look like to move through the world with just a bit more understanding and care. As we step into April, carry that with you. The reminder that your body is speaking to you, that your mind is working in ways that matter, that you don't have to figure it out all at once. Just the next right step, just the next moment of awareness, just the next small way you make space for yourself and for others. And that space, it's enough. So as always, Nacho Knots, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember, predictability gives us grounding, balance gives us sustainability, and joy reminds us why we keep going. I'll see you next week on the Neuro-Affirming Conversation Hour for outreach and support. So until then, be gentle with yourself. You're doing better than you think.
Thank you for joining us. See you next week. The views and opinions expressed in this video are solely those of the creator and do not reflect the views of any institution, employer, or affiliated organization.